All right, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for today's session on Internet for the People. So I'll get us started off, introduce our speakers, inform you all just a little bit about how we're going to be doing the question and answer, and then I will stop speaking and turn it right over to our excellent panelists. Despite its inception in military research, the internet in its early days was championed by anarchists and techno-utopians as something that promised to unite us while creating a more equal society. Now, at a moment when the internet is increasingly carved up and controlled by a handful of large companies, when it seems to magnify our worst rather than our best collective impulses, and when many argue that it widens the inequality gap, what an internet by and for the people might look like is an urgent question. This event is brought to you by the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy and is part of the Center's series on capitalism, socialism, and democracy. My name is Zachary LOEB. I'm a PhD candidate in the history and sociology of science here at the University of Pennsylvania, and I am one of the Mitchell Center's graduate fellows for the year. It is my honor to introduce our two excellent panelists today. JESSA Lingel is an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication, where she studies digital culture, looking for the ways that relationships to technology can show us gaps in power or possibilities for social change. She is the author of Digital Countercultures and the Struggle for Community, An Internet for the People, The Politics and Promise of Craigslist, and most recently, The Gentrification of the Internet, How to Reclaim Our Digital Freedom. Ben Tarnoff is a tech worker, writer, and co-founder of Logic magazine. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Jacobin, The Guardian, The New Republic, and in many other outlets. He is the author of the book Internet for the People, which is forthcoming from Verso Books this summer. And I have a link that Ben has kindly provided to be able to order that book with the discount code, which I will drop into the chat. So to start our session off, each of our panelists is going to speak for a little while, and then we will have plenty of time for questions and discussion. For that part, we will be using the Q&A function, and you can just drop your questions in there, and hopefully we'll be able to get to all of them. So without further ado, I shall stop speaking and turn it over to our panelists.
Thanks so much, Zachary. And thank you, Zachary, and the Mitchell Center for making this event possible. It's going to be a lot of fun. And thanks so much for joining JESSA, and for all of you, although we can't see your faces, who are joining us virtually. I thought I would give just a very brief overview of the arguments that I make in my forthcoming book, Internet for the People, and hopefully that gives us a way to think through the question of what it would mean and what it would take for the internet to be for the people. I'm going to share my screen because I put together a sometimes silly little slideshow for you. Let's see, share screen. Hopefully I can do this without too much trouble. Can you see the cover of my book? Okay. Cool.
Working.
So that's what it looks like. This is my only attempt at a hard sell. So I think the place to start, I'd like to start, is to reflect a little bit about the contemporary conversation about the internet. Over the past couple of years, we've seen a growing recognition from a lot of different quarters of the popular conversation that the internet is broken. And it's important to acknowledge here that scholars and activists have been pointing that out for a long time. This is not really a new observation, but I think it's fair to say that since 2016, tech critique has gone mainstream in what's come to be known as the techlash, a kind of unfortunate word, an unlovely word, but one that's stuck. And through the techlash, and I have a good image here to illustrate the techlash for you, which is little thought bubble of someone angry at a computer. This is a feeling we can all relate to these days. Through the techlash, the idea that the internet is broken has become a new common sense. It's kind of ubiquitous at this point. It's subject of New York Times investigations, congressional hearings, executive orders, popular documentaries, and so on. So the premise of my book is that, yes, the internet is broken. And it's broken because it's a business, which is to say the crises that have provoked the techlash are inextricable from the fact that the internet is owned by private firms and run for profit. This is another person having a techlash moment. Hopefully this is relatable to us. So the annihilation of our privacy, the amplification of right-wing propaganda, the exploitation of app-based workers, these diverse forms of social damage facilitated by the internet, to name just a few, wouldn't exist if they weren't profitable. But the internet wasn't always a business. It had to be made a business. And my book is mostly about how the internet was made into a business. Now, this occurred through a process of privatization. This is Comic Sans, which also has a great history on the internet. And this process of privatization not only created the modern internet, it also set in motion the crises that have provoked the techlash. So in my view, the techlash is best understood as a belated reckoning with the legacies of the internet's privatization. So what do I mean by privatization? I think a little bit of backstory on the internet is useful here. The internet started out in the 1970s as an experimental technology created by US military researchers. In the 1980s, it grew into a government-owned computer network used primarily by academics. And then in the 1990s, privatization began. Now, importantly, the privatization of the internet was a process, not an event. It did not involve a simple transfer of ownership from the public sector to the private, but rather a more complex movement whereby corporations programmed the profit motive into every level of the network. So in this way, a system that was really built by scientists, funded primarily by the Pentagon, was renovated for the purpose of profit maximization. And as you can imagine, this was a pretty complicated process. It took interventions at a variety of levels, at hardware, software, legislation, entrepreneurship. It took decades, so it's actually a fairly long process. And it touched all of the internet's many pieces. Now, before moving on, we should briefly talk about what the pieces of the internet are. Because to talk about what the internet, how the internet was privatized, we need to talk a little bit about what the internet is, which is not a very easy thing to do, especially not succinctly. If you Google image search for the internet, which is kind of like how I try to understand anything, at least at first, you get something like this, which is not so helpful. There's actually a ton of these like glowing planets that represent the internet, which is very weird. So what's a better starting point than these stock images for thinking about the internet? I think a better starting point, and one that I expand on at some length in my book, is to say that the internet is fundamentally a language. It's a language that lets different computer networks talk to each other and thus interconnect to form a global network of networks, an internetwork, which is, of course, the origin of the term internet. Now, I think that's fairly easy to grasp, but what gets complex is that the structures across which this language is spoken are so vast and exist at so many different scales that it's difficult to visualize them as a whole. And this is where metaphors are particularly useful. Metaphors are often useful in computing because we can't visualize what we're working with. So we use kind of really make extensive use of metaphors to try to understand what's invisible to us. And one metaphor in computing and in networking more broadly that comes up a lot is the stack. It's one that I think is probably the best way to approach the internet. So a stack, what is a stack? A stack is simply a set of layers piled on top of each other. You can think of a house. This is a plumbing diagram of a house. And you have the first floor, you have the second floor, all the way up to the roof. And, particularly in the context of plumbing, the things you do further up in a house, they often depend on systems located further down. So if you're taking a shower, maybe on the second floor, you've got a water heater in the basement, which is represented by that little cylinder down in the basement of this diagram. A water heater, of course, warms up cold water being piped into your house and then pipes it up into your bathroom so you can take a shower. This is actually a kind of reasonable way to think about the internet, which is to say the internet also has a basement. Its basement also consists largely of pipes. And everything you do up the stack, like sending an email or looking at Twitter or watching a Zoom webinar, depends on these pipes working properly. More specifically, the basement of the internet looks a lot like this. I confess that I picked the ugliest photo that I could find. There are all sorts of very beautiful photos of kind of glowing futuristic data centers that they like to use. But this is from a wonderful subreddit called Cable Porn, where technicians post usually very elegant looking racks, but this is like just hideous. So I obviously picked it. But this is more or less what the basement of the internet looks like, which is a lot of cables, primarily fiber optic cables that run under oceans and across continents, and racks of routers. And all of this machinery, of course, ensures that all of those computer networks that compose the internet can speak to one another. Now, the reason we're talking about the basement and the pipes of the internet is that this is where the process of privatization began in the 1990s. And that's why we're going to look at a lot of photographs of Bill Clinton using the internet. There are so many photographs of Bill Clinton using the internet on the internet. I've picked a handful of my favorite. Now, privatization didn't come out of nowhere. It was the plan all along, but it happened quite fast. So by the early 1990s, just to set the stage, I mentioned before that the internet comes out of military research, specifically DARPA, the Pentagon's storied R&D arm. But by the early 90s, the internet is under the control of the National Science Foundation, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you in the audience as academics, but is a federal agency for supporting research. And the internet as such was at that point primarily used by academic researchers. But it was becoming increasingly popular. And there were kind of growing demands for more communities, more people to get connected to the internet. So that pushes the NSF to make the transition to privatization sooner than expected, because the thought process among the policymakers at the time was that in order to increase capacity of the kind that would be needed to accommodate all of this new interest in getting online, privatization was the only way to generate the required investment. Privatization was widely seen, in other words, as the only way to make the medium mainstream. And this privatization ended up taking an especially extreme form, thanks to extensive industry influence over the process and, of course, the broader ideological climate of the 1990s, with the free market triumphalism of Clintonism. And then, of course, you've got Newt Gingrich's Republicans in Congress. Newt Gingrich, in particular, having a strange turn as a kind of techno-libertarian in the 90s. You may recall somewhat flattering Wired interview with Newt Gingrich. The 90s was a very strange place. But suffice to say that there was a broad ideological consensus over the need to rapidly and very deeply and thoroughly privatize the internet, the result of which was that a network created at enormous public expense was completely ceded to the private sector. And to give you a sense of the scale of this move, I mean, the internet was brought into existence. I mentioned before that the protocols that underlie the internet, which are essentially the substance of the language of the internet, were invented in the 1970s. So the internet was brought into existence through decades of public funding and public planning. And not only did the basic technology have to be invented, but the infrastructure had to be built, specialists had to be trained, and contractors had to be staffed, funded, and in some cases directly spun off from government agencies. There's a quote that I have in my book from the scholar and activist Nathan Newman, where he points out that the internet is often compared to the federal highway system, the information superhighway, in terms of another kind of big public project. But he points out that actually that's not even a fair comparison, because imagine if, in the case of the internet, if the government had not only built highways, but invented cars, invented asphalt. I mean, this is really from the ground up in terms of how intimately involved government money, and specifically Pentagon money, is in the development of networking and internetworking. So what's striking about the moves to privatize the pipes in the 1990s is that they come with no conditions, that the federal government would not preserve any real kind of public foothold in the new internet and not prescribe any rules dictating how the new owners of the internet's core infrastructure, the so-called backbone providers, ran their networks. Now, crucially, there was nothing in the technical composition of the internet that predetermined this kind of extreme privatization. There were other ideas floating around at the time, some of which I explore in my book, that could have popularized the internet without completely privatizing its pipes. There was a proposal in particular to create a so-called public lane on the information superhighway. Senator Daniel Inouye actually introduced a bill that would have done this. And this would have guaranteed free access to the internet to organizations like libraries and would have provided them even with funding to develop their own online programming. It's a model that took inspiration from public media. But there wasn't a social movement. And that's really the critical thing, isn't it? That we have a lot of good ideas, but we don't have the movement to generate enough pressure to implement those ideas against industry opposition. So what happens is that in April 1995, the federal government decommissioned the NSFnet, which was the core NSF-run backbone of the internet up to that point, and the telecoms take over. There are further deregulatory moves over the course of the 90s and into the early 2000s that further entrench the telecoms control and lead to what we have today, which is a highly concentrated market in internet service. All right, one more photo of Bill Clinton. Okay, we're going to come back to our house. So I said before that the privatization of the internet was a process, not an event, and that privatization programs the profit motive into every level of the network. So at the level of the pipes, the source of profit is pretty straightforward. You're monetizing access, right? You're making money from getting people online, selling internet subscriptions, or from operating the deeper plumbing of the network, getting data from one place to another. But the real money with the internet didn't lie in monetizing access. It lay in monetizing activity, which is to say, not getting people online, but making money from what people did once they got online. So the next phase of privatization was to ascend to the upper floors, so to speak, of the internet, to the layer where the internet is experienced. And moving up the stack, this is often what's called the application layer. This is where we really use the internet. These are the sites, these are the apps, these are the, to refer back to our plumbing analogy, this is you taking a shower on your second floor and relying on the pipes in the basement. So the question which faces this next phase of privatization, which unfolds in the 90s, is how does one maximize profit at this layer? And this, as you might expect, is the central focus of the dot-com boom that began with Netscape's explosive IPO in August 1995. I suspect or hope that most of us know what Netscape was. Maybe I'm dating myself, but Netscape being really the browser that popularized the web. Not the first graphical web browser, but the first one that anyone really used. And it had this huge IPO where I think at the end of the first day of trading, company was worth $3 billion. Obviously, it had not turned a profit yet. If you're familiar with Mark Andreessen, this is him on the cover of Time magazine. He was a co-founder of Netscape, and there's a lot of interesting stories there that we could tell. But this is widely seen as the moment that kicks off the dot-com boom. So over the following years, tens of thousands of startups were founded, hundreds of billions of dollars invested. But the profits failed to materialize for the most part, famously, in the dot-com boom. There's a good quote from Ed Horowitz, the CEO of Viacom from '96. The internet has yet to fulfill its promise of commercial success. Why? Because there is no business model. It's pretty plain spoken. Now, he's exaggerating slightly. There are some profitable internet companies in this period, but for the most part, this is true. And that is obviously made particularly salient by the implosion of the dot-com bubble, which occurs in 2000 and 2001. And there are a lot of postmortems at the time and since about why the dot-com era fails. But in the book, I argue that the real problem was structural, that the dot-coms are trying to advance the next stage of the internet's privatization, although they wouldn't have understood it in precisely those terms, namely by pushing privatization up the stack. But the structures that could make such a push feasible were not yet in place. That those structures are actually built in the aftermath of the dot-com bust when a new set of complex computational systems begin to emerge And these would come to be known as platforms. So these are the Googles, the Facebooks. It's platform is a term that I dislike and kind of take issue with in the book. So what I want to think about them more is as shopping malls. I call them online malls in the book. This is not an original observation. I credit the scholar Jathan Sadowski, among others, in helping me think about platforms as online malls. But I think it's a useful way to understand them because they are corporate digital enclosures with a wide range of interactions transpiring inside of them. In particular, they have the following characteristics, I would argue. They are a middleman, since they facilitate interactions. These might be interactions between buyers and sellers. Think about eBay, which is something I spend a lot of time on eBay in the book. Between searchers and websites, between someone who needs a ride and an Uber driver. They are sovereign. They write the rules for these interactions. They are the maker and the beneficiary of network effects, which is simply to say that they benefit from having more interactions occur within their enclosures. And absolutely crucially, they are the manufacturer and monetizer of data. So what distinguishes the online mall, and which is the kind of real basis of the breakthrough for pushing privatization up the stack, is the ability to record and interpret all of these interactions that are transpiring within these corporate digital enclosures. So online malls are really designed for making use of data. Of course, how they make data and how they monetize it varies, and there is considerable variation in the business models of these big firms. But broadly, these are kind of the main features of the category of complex computational system that I think we could call the online mall. And this, in my argument, is really what makes it possible for privatization to be pushed up the stack in the 2000s and 2010s, and for the immense profit potential of the internet to finally be realized. So I know I'm running a little bit over, so I'm going to wrap it up. I want to just give a couple of kind of points about what are the consequences of all this? Like, why does it matter? What's the legacy? And I think if we had to choose one word to describe the legacy, it would be inequality. We have the legacy of the privatization of the pipes, simply put, is severe inequalities in broadband access, to the point that more than 162 million Americans do not use the internet at broadband speeds. This is a major social crisis, and I think one that is rooted in the privatization moves of the 1990s. This is a photograph of a woman using the internet to do her job in a parking lot at the height of COVID. It was the first wave in the spring of 2020, from a New York Times piece, where you have so many people who don't have reliable or good internet at home, who can't afford it, who had to flock to community centers just to get online, to do their job, to apply for jobs, for kids to do homework. It's really it's a huge problem, and one that I think is a direct result of privatization. Moving up the stack, we could have an endless conversation there, but you see inequalities generated through the internet facilitating the greater exploitation of workers, through an informational environment in which right-wing propaganda can proliferate ever more powerfully, and where racism, sexism, and other oppressions are algorithmically amplified. I know that's very brief, but possibly we'll have some time to discuss more in the conversation. So what is to be done? Deprivatization. That sounds simple, right? Deprivatization, very briefly, aims at creating an internet where people and not profit rule. This means, in my view, developing publicly and cooperatively owned alternatives to the corporate structures that can diminish the power of the profit motive and encode real democratic control. And I know that sounds a bit general, but I do have specifics in mind. But if we do actually deprivatize, this is what the internet will look like. Okay, that's all I have. Sorry for speaking a little bit over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will now turn it over to Professor Lingel.
Hi, thanks so much. Thank you, Zachary, for organizing, and thanks also to the Andrea Mitchell Center. And of course, it's wonderful to share the virtual stage with Ben Tarnoff. So I'm excited to be here. It is obviously fun, in particular, to share a book title. We share a book title. And the funny thing about that is that I originally had a very different title. I wanted to call this book The People's Republic of Craigslist, but then got some pushback. So instead it's called An Internet for the People. Why write a book about Craigslist? Well, to be a little bit reflexive about it, one key reason is that I myself am a longtime user of Craigslist. So these deck chairs I bought on Craigslist. There's another, I buy a lot of chairs on Craigslist. This dresser, you can see I sold that later on Craigslist. There's another chair I bought on Craigslist. This is Mr. Ficus. I bought that on Craigslist, and my phone, which I still have right here, I also bought on Craigslist. So I buy a lot of things on Craigslist, and I have for many years, buy and sell. That's one reason for writing a book about a platform. But then, of course, as someone who's been studying digital culture, there are some other reasons for writing a book about Craigslist. Oh, one other fun fact. I first met Zachary many, many years ago when we were both librarians in New York. I was a librarian at MTV. People often think that there's some fun story of how I got that job, but the truth is I answered an ad on Craigslist. So even the career right now that I have goes back to having a PhD in library science, which goes back to having a job in library science. So in some weird way, answering a Craigslist ad in 2007 actually led to the job I have now, if you think about it. All right, I owe Craigslist a lot. Why though? Why, as an academic, continue to write a book about it? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So one is that in internet years, Craigslist is very old. So it goes online as an email list in 95 and then becomes a website in 1996. This is very old in internet years, right? So the book has been around a long time and thus has an interesting story to tell. The company is not just very old, it's also been very stable, and that is also unusual in internet companies. So here you have founder Craig Newmark, who is many things, but also a friend to pigeons. And then here you have the current CEO, Jim Buckmaster, who took over in 1999. So these two people have been at the helm of Craigslist almost since its inception. I mean, Craig has been there since its inception. So that's a lot of stability in internet times for internet corporations. And the other stability that it's had is it's never had more than 3 shareholders. So it's a privately held company. It's not publicly traded. And Craig and Jim currently, as near as I can tell, own all of the shares. So that enables certain kinds of decision-making that is not possible on a publicly traded platform. And I'm happy to get into that a little bit more, but in the political economy sense of things, the stability of Craigslist owes a lot to the fact that these two men are in lockstep in their control of the company and also their idea of what the company should look like. All right, fine. Craigslist isn't just old and stable in terms of its finances. It's very stable in terms of its appearances, famously so, you might say. So have you ever played the Wayback Machine game? This is the Annenberg School website in 1995, right? So the whole internet looks like this, friends. Do you remember when the whole internet looks like this? I remember when the whole internet looks like this. This is an elite private school dedicated to communication and digital culture, 1995. This is what the website looks like. A decade later, the website's looking better. And then now, of course, we have this wonderfully sexy website. You can't play this game with Craigslist, right? So here's what it looks like in 1998. 2008, okay, different. This is 2020. So you really have to squint to see major differences over a 10-year period between these two platforms, right? So it's in this sense that Craigslist, I would argue, is like an island in the middle of a constantly changing digital ocean. And the core premise of the book, one way I'm talking about the core premise of the book is to say, if we're interested in these shifting socio-technical changes, then surely one of the best vantage points is of real stability, where you can then perhaps evaluate more clearly some of these radical changes that have happened over the past 30 years, of which Craigslist has been around for 25 of them. And in particular, some of the changes that Ben was just speaking about this, about the shift to commercialization. So Craigslist has sort of been bearing witness to these changes and has had its own take on what commercialization of online technologies should look and feel like. There's another way for me of thinking about the reason for studying Craigslist. And as, again, someone who's been studying digital culture, at a certain point, I just wanted a counterexample to the platforms that had become so prevalent for studying in internet studies. So when we study digital culture, there is this over-reliance on platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, now, of course, Instagram and TikTok. And it's important to study the largest platforms. It's important to study the platforms that have the most power. But are there other stories that we can tell of platforms that have been very successful in their own right, that don't have the same sort of presence in internet studies, let alone in the public imagination? So Craigslist, you might think of as a sort of backwards looking website that doesn't have much to say to the internet of today. And yet it still has more monthly page hits than the New York Times or ESPN.com. Right, so it's been one of the top 20 most visited websites in the United States for over a decade. So purely in terms of popularity, it actually does have this important story to tell. But also, I would argue I had this sort of a deep need as like a committed socialist to want to ask about what would it look like for a mainstream platform that is incredibly successful to offer up a different vision of monetization strategies, a different set of relationships between people and users. And so that, beyond my own fondness for Craigslist, and I certainly also have my critiques of the platform, is really what is informing this book, what was really driving the book project. Okay, very quickly, this is some of the methods that I used in this book. I did a bunch of interviews with Craigslist users, also with insiders and experts, including Craig Newmark. The CEO, Jim Buckmaster, wouldn't talk to me, so instead I read all 300 of his blog posts. I also did a scrape of the Craigslist help forum, and I cannot encourage you enough to check out something called Craigslist TV, which is a YouTube-based TV series that ran in 2010, where every episode unpacks a Craigslist ad. And man, the next time you need a rabbit hole, that should be the one you get. The Reddit forum for Craigslist is not as good as cable porn, but it is good in its own right, particularly if you're interested in whether or not something is a scam on Craigslist. There's something I call mashup blogs, which are blogs that take Craigslist posts and try to make art out of them. They do a legal analysis of some of Craigslist court cases, which turned out to be a very important way of trying to learn more about how the company works financially. When a company is publicly traded, the advantage for a researcher is that you have more information about their public operations. When you are dealing with a privately traded company, court proceedings actually become one of your best friends. Unusually, for those of you who know me, I am not a quantitative scholar by any means, but I did a survey because I wanted some sense of external validity of how people actually use this platform. So an N of 91 is actually pretty big for me. Okay, briefly, let me tell you a little bit how the book is structured, and then I want to leave you just with a couple of the key arguments from the book. So the first half of the book talks about what Craigslist is. So I try and give a social history of the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1990s. Just briefly, I'll say now we think of San Francisco as this major tech headquarters, but in the 1990s, and I say this as a California, as a third generation Californian, in the 1990s, the tech center of California was in the South Bay, not in the San Francisco Bay. So it was a very different scene than it is now, which has a lot to do with how Craigslist took shape and the decisions it made. I tell a media history of Craigslist as the sort of last stop in some ways of the classified ad industry in the United States and the newspaper industry. And then again, a little bit of a legal analysis of some of Craigslist's key court battles around data ownership and platform neutrality. And then the second half of the book talks about how Craigslist gets used. So they go into an analysis of buying and selling on Craigslist, on using Craigslist to find work, particularly in the gig economy, on Craigslist personal ads. And also I look at some of the people problems on Craigslist. So some of the scams that surface on Craigslist, but also problems with just things like flaking or a concern around harassment and physical violence that occasioned by Craigslist. So that's really how the book is structured. And then I want to, before turning it back over to hopefully have a conversation with Ben and Zachary and those of you who are in the audience, I would say there are a couple things that the book really taught me. Number one has to do with the business models, as I was saying, of platforms. So we have been sold a line that the internet should be free to use. And by free, we mean that you yourself become the product. So there is a particular narrative in mainstream, incredibly successful tech companies like Facebook, but certainly others, that the trade-off here is that we get to use their services for free, and then in exchange, they get to target ads to us. And this has certainly become a dominant business model within social media companies in the mainstream internet. I think it is important to remember Craigslist as a company that has a very different monetization strategy. So if you are sitting there using Craigslist and you don't know how the company makes money, it's because you've simply never been charged for an ad. So most people who post an ad on Craigslist don't pay anything. You only pay something if you're listing a job posting as an employer, or if you are a realtor posting your company, or if you are a furniture warehouse selling a product, right? All of those things, if you're dealers, you pay a small amount of money. Otherwise, you're using the platform for free. So if you don't know how Craigslist makes money, that's because you simply have never been asked to pay any. If you don't understand how Facebook makes money, that is because the company deliberately wants you not to know that. The company wants you as the user to be as transparent as possible to the platform, while the platform wants to be as obscure as possible to you in terms of its inner workings. Now, this difference in visibility is a fundamental difference in how people should or should not retain autonomy over their information or their data when they go online. And it's also a fundamental difference in business models. So that's one of the key takeaways for me in terms of Craigslist. The other thing that came through so saliently for me in interviews had to do with seeing Craigslist as part of, to quote a participant, the poor people's internet. So this idea surfaced in interviews over and over again that Craigslist was particularly useful for people who were looking for relationships that couldn't be met online, whether that's because they were interested in kink or whether that was because they occupied a subject position that wasn't desirable on online platforms. Another huge group of people who found Craigslist very personal as useful before they were shut down were sex workers. And then the Craigslist personals occupied this place in the imagination of the digital public around being for working class people or being for a particular group of people. But this is also true for finding work on Craigslist, where a particular kind of gig work that didn't have a lot of upward mobility was imagined to be salient on Craigslist. And over time, as I heard again these metaphors of Craigslist being the poor people's internet, of being yesterday's internet, I really started to think of the metaphor of gentrification in terms of digital culture. So I'd actually always had these hesitations around using spatial metaphors for the internet, although I've sort of started to change my mind around that. But I did want to a little bit connect this book to the book that came next, which was this idea that one way of telling the story of the commercialization of online technologies, as Ben was spelling out, has to do with what I would call a gentrification and what the internet should look like. Its commercialization, its tendency towards homogeneity of its users, siloing, filter bubbling of its users, and also its intense inequalities of access. So all of those ideas were originally coming to me through my interviews with people, in particular when they were talking about finding work on Craigslist. So I'll just close by saying it is not at all my intent to say that like the internet would be better if every part of it looks like Craigslist, right? Like I certainly don't want YouTube to look like Craigslist, or I don't want to look, Hulu or my bank necessarily to look like Craigslist. But what I do want is to think about what it means to have this platform that has held on to its 1990s internet values for so long, continue to be successful and profitable in a climate where we've been told that its business model shouldn't work, that people shouldn't find it useful, and that the platform itself shouldn't have survived. Pushing back on those narratives, I think, is important purely in terms of internet history and building a more robust archive of the internet, but also for pushing back on some of these what have come to feel like foundational claims of the internet about who it's meant to serve, about commercialization and commodification. So I will leave it there for now and really look forward to people's questions.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you both, and thank you to everybody who has joined us and is listening. I would like to encourage everybody to please make use of the question function. Put your questions in there and we will get to them. And while we wait for those to come in, I guess that I will use the moderator's prerogative to start us off. And a question that I have for both of you that kind of goes off something that you were saying right at the end there, Jessa, is this comment about kind of the 90s internet, and not just the aesthetic of it, but maybe kind of the different attitude around it, which we also heard you bring up, Ben, in terms of the early days and all of these images of, especially President Clinton sitting in front of the computer. And that does seem kind of to be in quite a contrast with so much of what we then saw in Web 2.0 and the types of things that are now being imagined under the heading of Web 3, which I'm sure we can argue about in lots of different ways. But the question that I have is beyond kind of the nostalgic aesthetics of like 90s websites that can be fun to access through the Wayback Machine, like, are there really things about how the internet was in the 90s that like we should be pointing to as like, no, this was a better way to do it? That maybe in going forward, there is something to be said for looking backward to various things. I mean, there's a reason that Craigslist has held on for as long as it is, and maybe that those are things that kind of are very isolated in itself, but like, are there things from that case that can be applied on a broader scale, perhaps?
Well, I can take a first stab at that question. I suspect Jessa has more interesting and more specific things to say on this front about the 90s internet. I think I'd say broadly speaking, my kind of feeling about internet nostalgia, which is a kind of a pervasive phenomenon, and folks who I don't want to date us too specifically because I don't know our collective ages, but folks that are perhaps younger than us also feel in ways that we might feel nostalgic for the internet of 1995. They feel nostalgic for the internet of 2010. So, which is to say, internet nostalgia is still with us, and it kind of there are always eras of the internet that one can feel nostalgic for. To my mind, nostalgia is interesting because there is a political potential there that can be harvested. In other words, I think nostalgia is less interesting as any kind of accurate indicator of how what I would say is nostalgia to me is less useful in its kind of immediate direct form, which is to say, I want to return into internet of before, and more interesting as a entry point to get people thinking about alternative futures for the internet. In my book, I talk a little bit about E.P. Thompson's discussion of Luddism in his magisterial The Making of the English Working Class. And Thompson points out that the Luddites looked backward in order to look forward, that they had a vision of a kind of moral economy of technology that was integrated with the democratic polity. But to substantiate that vision, they drew from an idealized past, a past that never existed, but nonetheless was generative for them in imagining a possible future in which technology could be put to constructive social ends and not used as an instrument of exploitation and immiseration. To my mind, that's what's interesting about nostalgia, that we could harvest nostalgia, and what we could feel nostalgic for are the missed opportunities, the possible futures that were foreclosed by privatization, and potentially kind of harness that to a new social movement to deprivatize the internet, which I know is unlikely.
Thing that I would like to see reconsidered from the 1990s is just like an embrace of the uncertainty. So when I would talk to people about setting up Craigslist in the 1990s, they would just say over and over, like, we just didn't know, people didn't know what the internet was. And so you could sort of create, you had more of a capacity to create an idea of what the internet could be. And I do wonder about that. I have students who are just so certain that they know what Web3 means. And I'm like, that has not stabilized yet. We do not know yet what that is going to be. I remember a time when we talked about ubiquitous computing, which then became Internet of Things, which is unclear to me how that is or isn't the same as Web3 or Web 3.0. So I am very hesitant about the certainty that we often have when we talk about the internet, like this is what it is and this is what it is for, and returning to a time when people were willfully uncertain or willfully curious about what the internet could become, I think would be great. I also will say the thing about Craigslist that I enjoy from the 1990s is like a sense that the contract between people and platforms was more up for grabs. So that at different points when Craigslist became financially unsustainable, they would just kick it over to the users and be like, what do you think we should do? Do you think we should have a virtual tip jar? Do you think we should, charge for certain kinds of ads? Do you think everything should be volunteer run? Like, what do you want to do? And then people kind of landed on something. You really can't imagine that kind of happening with like, oh, it turns out Twitter is financially unstable. Like, what are we going to do? And turning that over to the users. Instead, that's a question for the board, or I think Elon Musk now owns like a larger share of Twitter. So those are the people who are now. But there were other moments in Craigslist history where these questions of being up for grabs, which is a different way of my earlier argument about being uncertain, I think we're really productive, and is something I'd like to return to.
Thank you. All right, we have some questions coming in, so I'll start with those. And just putting it out there, if I mispronounce your name, my sincere apologies. So we have a question from Jeff Green, and this one is specifically for Ben from the looks of it. Can Ben elaborate a bit more on what a deprivatized internet experience might be like? How would it be / feel different on the day-to-day level of the user?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jeff. So as I mentioned, I think the horizon of a deprivatized internet is an internet where people and not profit rule. I think what that looks like concretely actually depends on what layer of the internet we're talking about. So we talked before in my brief remarks about the pipes versus the quote unquote platforms. Not a term I love, but a useful shorthand for the upper floors of the internet. At the level of the pipes, what a deprivatized internet looks like is actually fairly straightforward. We have in the United States hundreds of communities with municipally owned and cooperatively owned broadband networks that are serving people all over the country. And again, there are a variety of models here, but in general, these are entities that are able to diminish the power of the profit motive and make investments in kind of community connectivity at low cost, high quality, and really serve social ends rather than investors and shareholders. Now, we need public policy to expand, to deepen, to further democratize these community networks, but I think they give us, in miniature, the kind of basic building block of what a deprivatized internet, by which we mean deprivatize is a bit like defining through negative. By what do we actually really mean there? We mean an internet in which real democratic control is encoded into the functioning of the entities, and profit is not the primary consideration, and how things like connectivity, which is a fundamental human right, is allocated. So community networks provide a good building block at the level of the pipes. As we move up the stack, it becomes more complicated because the variety of the kind of range, the diversity of forms that one encounters at this altitude is actually much greater, and the complexity is much greater. You think about Comcast versus Google, the business model and the computational architectures of Google are a lot more complicated than they are of Comcast. Google is also, of course, many times larger in terms of market cap and revenue than Comcast. So when we move up the stack, what I argue is that we need to find ways of diminishing the power of the big online malls through, among other things like, the anti-monopoly movement has a lot of creative ideas for how to diminish the power of the online malls. But as we do so, we need to develop alternative online spaces that can lay claim to the space that those online malls currently occupy. And there are a variety of interesting experiments that are being conducted by artists and academics and programmers throughout the internet that are developing, again, in miniature, what those might look like. One that comes up a lot and that I often point people to is Mastodon, which is a decentralized, federated social network, a bit like Twitter. It has its limitations, but again, that's a model of something that operates on very different principles than the big corporate platforms, where interoperability, where decentralization, where the possibility of a more participatory governance model and one in which the profit motive is diminished in priority becomes possible. But once again, all of these experiments will remain marginal until we have a social movement that is capable of demanding the type of public policy interventions that we need to make those viable. And crucially, when it comes to the platforms, that can fund the spaces we need where ordinary people can imagine alternatives. Because ultimately, things like Mastodon are wonderful, but these are fairly technical, fairly niche subcultures that attract certain types of folks. And if we actually want to create an internet for the people, we really need to create spaces where everyone can participate in the design and development and deployment of online spaces.
Great. We had another question. So JESSA put partially an answer to this, but I also do just want to ask it. This comes from Joseph Ben Simon. One of the big changes on the internet over the last couple of decades has been the rise of metrics and quantification. I'm wondering if our panelists can speak to how metrics do or don't serve internet users. I realize this is a large topic, but would be curious to hear any top of mind thoughts.
Sorry that I jumped the gun on that, Zachary, but my librarian slip was showing and I needed to send a citation in response to a question. I think quantification has become, maybe my favorite thing, and the list is short, about the 2016 election is that it became a way, the 2016 US presidential election, I should clarify, is the way that it pushed back on what was becoming a very popular narrative that we no longer need theories of things because we simply have the data. Like we can just ask a platform about how people are going to act and it'll tell us, this sort of fantasy of Cambridge Analytica. And then when we had these sort of shock elections in the United States, shocking to some, shock elections of Brexit, it really did illuminate the need that you can quantify all you like and still not really be able to predict what is going to happen. And so I think we're still kind of grappling with the lingering effects of the lure of big data, the lure of quantification and metrics. So on one hand, of course, they're very powerful tools. I wouldn't have wanted to go through the last 2 years of the COVID pandemic without certain forms of quantification. But I do think that it is one more way that these platforms do sell themselves as being necessary, or that they sell the sort of mining of data as a necessary and positive service, which comes with its own contingent forms of servitude. I did have one brief thing I also wanted to say to the prior question, which is my colleague Germaine Halegua has done some work on dark fiber, which are networks of internet cable that exist, that function, but aren't turned on. So there's a very good chance in certain urban areas, but even also suburban and rural areas, where there's actually plenty of internet access, broadband internet access. It's just called dark fiber because it hasn't been turned on. And one thing that I argue in the gentrification of the internet book is that wouldn't it be amazing if local governments used eminent domain not to continue a project of racist segregation of neighborhoods and city streets, but rather to claim ownership over dark fiber and then turn them over to the people, to like literally create an internet for the people? Because the actual technology is already there. It's just not turned on in some cases because of very complicated legal disputes over who still owns it, but in other cases just because the viable business model hasn't been there, and as Ben has said very convincingly, because the social will hasn't arisen around it yet.
I think another way to think about this, the metrics questions from Joseph, is also the kind of evolution of the internet. We're talking about 90s nostalgia. I think sometimes folks who don't remember the era of the 90s internet are surprised to hear that Yahoo, which of course was kind of the popular web portal of the time before Google took over, relied on a handmade directory of websites, that there were actually people who, found the best sports website and put it in the sports category on Yahoo. So which is just to say that part of the kind of development of more, let's say, advanced analytic methods on the internet came about in response to the problem of too much data, basically. That the internet, obviously data, has existed as long as we've had modern digital computing, since the 1940s, but the internet creates this greatly enlarged surface area for the manufacture of data. And that becomes a problem pretty early on in the 90s. And this is the basis of Google's ascent. I mean, this is the basis of Page and Brin's doctoral work at Stanford, and the basis of the original Google algorithm, PageRank. But, they say explicitly in their paper, people can't keep up with the amount of websites that people are making. We need to find a new way of organizing and analyzing that information. So that's just to say that the problem of too much data and the problem of having to develop kind of advanced analytical and really statistical methods for making it legible is there even before they have to figure out how to make money. That often the way that they're making money is by leveraging techniques that they've actually developed to make all the information of the web legible to the purposes of advertising. So that's kind of an interesting evolution.
So we have a question from Mike Godomsky. What does the political struggle for a deprivatized internet look like on the ground? In what sorts of arenas is it being fought?
I can take a first stab at that. I think that's a great question, Mike. I mean, I think, again, I think one of the most direct ones, I mean, when I think about what could I knock on someone's door and talk about, I think broadband is like a very direct, a very clear one. As I mentioned before, there is a massive connectivity crisis in this country. More than 162 million Americans don't have internet at broadband speeds. Most of the people who don't have home internet, it's because they can't afford it. We pay some of the highest internet fees in the world, actually, for some of the worst service. Like it's really an embarrassment. And the reason for that is because we have this highly concentrated market in internet service. There are 4 companies that account for 76% of internet subscriptions in the United States. They actively collaborate to avoid competing with one another, and they're constantly compensating their CEOs, $30+ million annual compensation, stock buybacks, dividends. The money is going up. It's not going into infrastructure. And that's why we're all struggling. So this is actually a very potentially powerful political issue because it speaks to a lot of different people, right? Communities, particularly working class communities of colors that are so-called digital redlined, where they don't have any good internet infrastructure. You can talk to folks in those communities and say, this is a scandal. But even folks in more middle class communities who are paying a lot of money for not very good service have an interest in a different arrangement as well. Like there's a potential for a kind of cross class coalition around building a better arrangement of the pipes. And again, the classic case, the case that is always pointed to when it comes to community networks in the United States is the Gig in Chattanooga, which is run by the New Deal era local electric utility company that started offering municipal broadband service in 2010, at the time the fastest in the country, and they're consistently rated by Consumer Reports as the best ISP in the country, right? So, to my mind, that's where the political struggle starts, because it's just such it's a good issue. It's like a good door knocking issue. I think the other issues that I was talking about the exploitation of gig workers, the amplification of oppressions algorithmically, the proliferation of right-wing propaganda on social media. Those are absolutely critical issues, but to my mind, those are issues that are often pursued best when they're kind of folded into other movements. So a movement for racial justice, hopefully all these movements are connected and speaking to one another. But so that's a kind of scattered first draft. I haven't thought deeply on it, but those are my preliminary impressions.
And I'll just build on that and shamelessly, enthusiastically plug the work. I'm on the steering committee for Philly Community Wireless, which is building mesh networks here in Philadelphia in underserved communities of color to build broadband networks. So we partner with a local ISP called Philly Whisper, providing free broadband internet for anyone who signs up. So I'll put that in the chat. And mesh networks have had many successes and also some failures, but Philly Community Wireless, I think, is so important precisely because we are the home of Comcast, which is certainly one of the major players in the problematic monopolization that Ben was talking about. And the other group that I'll point you to is sort of a specific group that's working in the second area that I was talking about with algorithmic harms is I love the Our Data Bodies project. And they have a specific digital defense playbook of how to do community engagement work around algorithmic harms, around inequalities of data, around the process-based harms that come through from everything from credit reporting to targeting of ads that disproportionately harm people of color and poor folks and working class people. So there are some groups that I'm really optimistic about that are doing this kind of community-based, grassroots-based work, and I'll pop some of those in the chat.
So we also received a question in the chat, which I think kind of builds off of the last question a little bit. So as we think about these issues and as we talk about these issues in a way that's maybe a little bit focused on the US, are there other international examples that we can look at right now that provide alternatives, inspiration? Are there other countries that are doing the internet very differently? Is there global homogenization of the web? I mean, is there a way to say, we should be copying what they're doing in X country?
Yeah, I think the global view is particularly interesting now because there's a lot of chatter about the kind of so-called splinternet, that the internet is breaking up into three internets: of the US internet, the European internet, which has been, very kind of regulation happy and has kind of set the tone for a lot of the rest of the internet, and the Chinese internet, which of course is, incredibly dynamic, but is largely, although not exclusively, a kind of closed world because of the great so-called Great Firewall of China. There's now speculation that Russia is, because of events unfolding now, maybe trying to create its own internet, although the architecture of the internet in Russia doesn't really permit that sort of thing. I know that's not a direct. That's kind of a side answer to your question because I was like struggling to think of a way to answer it. But I think I think the thing that I would say about like where should we look to for models is that the politics is always going to be more important than the technology. That's like just a good rule of thumb in general, right? That I think the technical configurations of the types of networking experiments that people are conducting, some of which are really cool, across the world, to my mind, are always going to have a little bit less like salience in terms of like the how powerful could this be than like the politics around it. And I guess to my mind, and this may just speak to my provincialism as an American, the kind of political organizing experiments. There's a group in Detroit in particular that I think does really phenomenal work. Those were the ones that I wanted to highlight. The Detroit Community Technology Project in particular. But JESSA, you may have a better answer to this question than I do.
I agree with you that at the level of pipes, I don't think there's much to do. There is obviously, with the EU and the GDPR, it would be great to see that kind of energy around regulation in the United States. And maybe some of that is happening. Unclear. I can say that one thing that would lead to more grassroots organizing is more, I'm hesitant to be like, we need different education, because education becomes this like scapegoat for all of societal's ills in a way that is like not fair. But if you can look to, as we usually do in these like conversations about socialism, Northern European countries. So Estonia, for example, has very impressive K through 12 education on digital literacy. They also have a much more robust infrastructure around civic participation online, tools for, say, voting online, for managing other parts of your civic life online. But then also just things like archiving the internet not being an effort of like a ragtag group of volunteers, but more of a federally supported program. And I think when you have those initiatives, you are able to have different conversations about who the internet is for and who should be served in a way that's just simply not possible here in the United States, because of the narratives that we have around who the internet is for are so deeply intertwined with the people who have been able to make money off of them. So I would look to when we think about deprivatizing the internet, I would say countries that have done some of that work in the ways that are most copyable are in Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark, Estonia, perhaps in particular, doing work around digital literacy, around laying the foundation for being able to have a more collective conversation about the internet and its harms and its opportunities.
We definitely do still have time for some more questions. So if you have one, please drop it in. And I do also want to, of course, offer JESSA and Ben the opportunity to ask each other questions. But I do just want to jump in with one. Sorry, JESSA, I have to put on our librarian hats since you referenced libraries before. And as we talk about various spaces, various efforts to democratize access, changing things up. This for me raises a question about what are ways to potentially make use of some of the already existing structures that we have, even if in some cases they are severely underfunded already. But places like libraries, places like community centers, places like public schools especially, do these places potentially have a role to play in, if not necessarily democratizing the internet, then at least democratizing access, and then to, I mean, really push this question back to Ben as well, like, do these places also potentially have a role in democratizing the internet?
Mm-hmm. I think I will say the public library is one of the things that makes me patriotic about the United States. And that list is short, right? Like public libraries in the United States, I think, are such a crucial part of our public infrastructure. I think, of course, they have a huge role to play when it comes to making the internet possible for people. And this is one thing, I mean, COVID obviously showed us the need for these public spaces, for broadband access, for obviously other things as well, like sociality and meeting spaces. I think, of course, the public library is also regulated in ways that some people are not aware of. The public library funding in some cases is tied to their ability to censor the internet in cases, you know. On the other hand, so when I think about, for example, community, the story of like Lingel NYC in New York, where the city of New York was going to convert a bunch of payphones into Wi-Fi hotspots. And then it also had these like tablets, you know, at these little weird little like 2001 Space Odyssey like tablets in the city. And there would be a bunch of folks who were housing insecure using the tablets, and people were like, oh no, I can't believe, who would have thought if we made internet stations available throughout the city of New York that people who don't have a place to live would use them to, I don't know, like watch porn, sure, but also like email and watch sporting events and watch television. And it's like, if you would ask a single public librarian in the city of New York, they would have told you that this was going to happen. So on the one hand, I think, of course, libraries have a key role to play in things like digital literacy, in things like workshops for communities. Philly Community Wireless that I was talking about earlier, we wouldn't be able to have the partnerships we have if we weren't working with the Free Library of Philadelphia to do some of that community engagement work. So they have all these roles to play, but they also have this incredible knowledge about what it would mean to have a public infrastructure for the internet, because they are part of that public infrastructure for information and digital access already.
I mean, I know a lot less about libraries, obviously, than either JESSA or Zachary, but I would make an impassioned plea for the role of librarians in creating a more democratic internet. I mean, librarians are the original information workers. You know, they know how to contextualize information, and they do so as a public service, not to make a profit. And you know, one of the things that we struggle with on social media, which is has to be seen within the broader history of highly commercialized U.S. media sphere, is context collapse and kind of sensationalism. These are not new things. You know, Neil Postman, George Trow, and others have been talking about this within the context of television in particular for a while. But social media is a kind of new frontier in it. And we need professionals in social media spaces who are capable of restoring the context that has been lost. Now, there are obviously stupid ways to do this, like, you know, kind of fact checking and putting 4 Pinocchios on something. So we'll have to be more sophisticated than that. But I think, I think librarians are essential. And, you know, I think there's also a kind of infrastructure element here that could be quite useful. The programmer Darius Kazemi, who's done a lot of interesting experiments in the decentralized web space, has this idea of, what if you had a federated social media server in every public library in the country? You know, thousands of public libraries in the United States. Everyone with a library card could have an account, and they would all interconnect to form a federation, so that if you had a problem, you obviously can't talk to Mark Zuckerberg, but you can knock on the door of your local librarian. So I'm very optimistic about the potential for the very constructive role librarians could play in online spaces. I think the scholar Joan Donovan has called for 10,000 librarians to be hired for the internet, and I would probably double that number.
So we have a question from Sarah Maloney. Thank you to the speakers for this very interesting discussion. In the Italian context, where recently there has been a tendency, especially among grassroots movements on the left, to abandon big platforms, Google, Twitter, and look for alternative ones as a fundamental political strategy. This raises issues about how many people can be reached and also about parallels with responsible green consumerism as an individual response to systemic problems. Do you see this happening in the US as well, and what do you think about it?
Do you want to go first, Jessa?
I think we unmuted at the same time. It's so hard for me to answer this question earnestly because I so want a splintering of social media platforms. Who knows, maybe we will get a sort of forced fragmentation of the platforms from above through antitrust regulation. It's unclear, although more possible than it's ever been with folks like Tim Wu and Lina Khan in fairly high level positions in the Biden White House. I am wary though, because having studied and worked with activist groups for some time, and having done some reading on activist groups outside the United States, there is, of course, we see this constant return of the idea of like activist groups need to be, it's a form of political action to remove yourself from these mainstream platforms. And I'm fairly ambivalent about it for some of the reasons that you mentioned in your question. So on the one hand, given the climate of harassment and misinformation that we have on these platforms, looking to alternative platforms seems like a pretty good idea. On the other hand, how do you combat those forms of misinformation, or how do you have some sort of public information campaign, or just indeed a form of collective discourse if people are on different platforms? In general, however, I think it is probably for the best if these platforms get less powerful, simply because they've proven so deleterious to any sort of functioning public that I have seen, particularly in the context of the political. So I think it's not a clear-cut answer, and I think that it's just, as with so many other things about the internet, a series of trade-offs. But certainly one thing in your question, Sarah, that I would hold up is like, it takes a degree of reflexivity and self, or like a fairly critical viewpoint of mainstream tech firms to remove oneself from the platform. And so if people are getting to that point, that in itself is a position of like reflexivity that I certainly embrace. So that in itself is something to be celebrated, even if the outcome is still ambivalent for me.
Yeah, Sarah, you point to the parallels with green kind of consumerism, and I think that's one that I would draw out a little bit. So, there's obviously this question of, if I put solar panels on my house, how politically useful is that? Because obviously something broader, quote unquote, more structural, which is a term we like to use a lot these days, is required, right? But I think there is a kind of complicated interplay, a dialectic possibly, between those two scales. And I think in particular of the appropriate technology movement of the 60s and 70s, where a lot of folks who were getting kind of burned out on, let's say, mass politics as the movements of the time were receding, kind of go into the woods and start to experiment with what we would now call kind of renewable technologies, and are building some of the early prototypes, experimenting, developing some of the early technologies around solar panels, around heat pumps, around all sorts of technologies now that we see as the foundation of the energy transition. Obviously, for those experiments to become active at the scale at which we need them to be active, states have to be involved. So in particular, to think about the recent history, the Greens in Germany have to push through a kind of energy transition policy that incentivizes the Chinese to scale up huge amount of solar panel production to the point that the costs drop. So we need states unfortunately. I say that ambivalently as someone with, left libertarian and autonomous sympathies, but we need states to have to create the kind of scale. But what they can draw upon are in many cases experiments that small communities have put together. And I think the analogy here to the internet is important because there are these small communities that are clustered under the banner of the decentralized web, platform cooperativism, and others that are producing some really interesting things. For those things to scale, for them to become politically active, for them to be a real threat to the powers that be, public policy interventions are required. But it's important that those experiments are being conducted because if they weren't, we would have nothing to start from.
Thank you. So I think that we have a nice kind of fitting question to wrap up on here of if there are any books and articles on tech or otherwise that you would recommend or that you've been particularly excited about recently. Although I do just want to say that you should definitely make sure to go out and read JESSA's books that are available. And I am going to put the link to order Ben's forthcoming book in the chat again for everybody, but we'll turn it.
Yeah, what have you been reading, Ben?
So I think I have to just like plug Logic magazine right now. I have to be the hype man. So we just put out a new issue called Clouds. There is, I think, a wonderful piece in that by Miriam Posner, who is a brilliant scholar at UCLA, on the story of agile software development, which is like, agile is just one of these things that is somewhat of a religion. One engineer described it to me as it's like Christianity. Like it's just the kind of background substance for so much of modern software engineering. And it's also really critical for understanding how software has changed in the era of the internet, because agile is all about the kind of collision of traditional software with the internet. And anyway, I really encourage people to check that out. logicmag.io. Yeah.
I'm dropping in the chat. This is an article by Dave Karp, who read every single issue of Wired magazine in order and then sort of reflected on what those articles taught him, which I thought was cool. I just thought that was cool. So I learned a lot from that. What else have I been reading? Yeah, that's the first thing that I have to say comes to mind. I'm sure I'll think of other things as soon as I end this call, and then I will be sad that I wasn't able to post it here.
Well, thank you both so much for your excellent presentations and for this wonderful discussion and for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. And thank you all very much for joining us and asking these wonderful questions. I know that we aren't actually going to be able to see you because of the way that this is set up, but wherever you are, please do join me in giving a round of applause for our speakers.
I felt it. Ben, did you feel it? I felt it.
I did. It was very powerful.
Good. You felt it in your hearts through the power of Zoom.
Absolutely.
Again, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you, Ben, and thank you, JESSA.
Thank you so much. This is so much fun. Appreciate everybody's time. Have a good weekend.